Hello everyone and welcome back to another layout update. So this layout update is going to be for the month of November. However, it's been about 7 months since my last layout update, so as you can probably imagine, I have started a few more projects since then. I've completed some others and I'm in the midst of working on a few other projects. So there's lots going on the layout. However, I will admit a lot of the progress did happen or take place this month and a little bit last month, and I'll explain why a little bit later on in this video. Essentially, I've just been extremely busy with work, and about the time I released the last layout update, I believe I was just finishing finals for school. I decided to go back to school in September, so I've been very busy with that. It's a little more intense than the last course that I was enrolled in. And then on top of that, I just worked my tail off the entire summer, so it didn't really leave me with a whole lot of time to get up here, and obviously with school, that doesn't leave me with a lot of time either. So it's just kind of when I work on the layout essentially when I can find time. But there's lots to cover in this layout update, so stay tuned. So recently here in the last 2 weeks, I was able to host an operating session on my layout here. I don't have any real ops or operations set up on this layout or designed on this layout just yet. That'll be further down the road. However, it was more of a run session, so there was various trains running and lots of people socializing. It was a lot of fun. Had a great group of guys out here. However, what that prompted me to do prior to the ops session, I was able to go around the layout and finish up a few cosmetic jobs, I guess, that I had ongoing or had delayed or forgot about. One of those projects was installing the last of the UP5 panels, with the exception of one for my pulp mill, because that's way down the road and no one will need to use a UP5 where that's going to be located currently. So I had 3 UP5 panels that I had to install, one of which was here, which is going to be eventually probably like a rail car servicing shop and some dead tracks for locomotives, etc. This didn't see a lot of use. However, it's just nice to have an extra additional plugin, because from the first op session that I ever hosted, there was a ton of traffic, foot traffic per se, roaming around this UP5 panel in the middle of the yard, and that was because obviously you have both the upper and lower yards, which tend to be pretty busy. So adding this UP5 panel just provided another place for people to plug into. That way I don't get a huge group of guys congregating around that UP5 panel, because obviously it's a bit of a pinch point in the bench work. Although it is still a nice decently sized walkway, it does get a little crowded there. The other one, I'm not going to move the camera too much around for this. However, the other UP5 panel I installed was way at the end there, at the other end of the intermodal yard. And again, didn't see a lot of use. However, it just provides another area for an operator to plug into. That way we don't all kind of congregate around some of the main ones, and we can kind of spread ourselves out a little bit. We're going to hop over to the grade and branch line, because over there has received a little bit of work, and I'll go over with you what I've accomplished. So the third and final place that I installed a UP5 panel was at the top of the grade here. This one does receive a fair amount of use, especially when we have trains passing on the siding. Prior to me installing that UP5 panel, many of the operators were just using the UP5 panel here on the branch line, which worked just as well. But again, it's nice to be able to have a multitude of different plugins. That way we're not all kind of crowding around 1 or 2 different UP5 panels in order to have our throttles connected to the Digitrax system if they're not handheld. So the next topic of discussion is going to be the branch line. The first thing which you might be able to notice in the opening shot is that I have filled in a lot of the tie gaps where I've had to make a solder or a joint in the rails. The only places that I have not filled in the tie gaps would be the switches coming off this main branch line. The reason for this is I'm going to have to take out these Walthers Shinoharas so that I can install Tortoise switch machines. Now, Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get my hands on any Tortoise switch motors prior to the op session, so these switches just stayed as hand throws as such, which didn't cause too many problems, but obviously it's not ideal considering the rail cars engines have a tendency to pick those points which are fairly loose. Which brings me on to the next project that I've been working on. I've also gone ahead and started to install these Caboose Industries hand throws. Now the reason for this was because the first op session that I ever hosted, we experienced a lot of issues with trains derailing and locomotives and cars picking the points on these Walter Sheen O'Hara turnouts, and this is just because the points are just super loose on the switch. There's not a lot of friction there. Compared to the Pico or Micro Engineering, which have a snap mechanism. So I made it my goal to install as many of these hand throws as I could prior to the op session, just to prevent issues from occurring and reoccurring. Because it's no fun having your train derail constantly on you when you're just trying to switch cars or operating in the yard. So there's a number of locations on the layout which I'll take you through and show you all these hand throws that I've installed. It mainly took place on the branch line and then also the upper level yard, because that's where a majority of these Walther switches are on my layout. The rest, and basically from I'd say the beginning of this year onward, I stopped buying these switches and going with the Picos just because I do like the snap mechanism. But I'll go ahead and I'll show you and explain how I did this. Just give me 1 minute. So it seems as though I have a tendency to overcomplicate a lot of my projects on this layout. And you're probably wondering what I mean by this. And essentially, in regards to the installation of the hand throws, I decided to go with the N-scale versions of the Caboose Industry hand throws. And the main reason for this is just the size of them. I like them a lot more than the HO versions, which are a little bit larger and bulkier. I think they just look a little better in that sense. But what happened, or what I found out when I went to install these, as I should have anticipated, the amount of throw that the N-scale provides is not nearly enough for HO track, because there's a larger distance to close. This was kind of poor thinking on my behalf. However, this prompted me to modify all of the Walther's turnouts. Now, in order to make these N-scale hand throws work on HO scale turnouts, you have to do some modifications to them. I did this by first ordering a number of these PC board ties from Fast Tracks, which for those of you who don't know, they're meant for handling turnouts and track. I find I use them more for repairs and modifications if the rail becomes separated from the ties or a turnout becomes out of gauge. However, in order to modify the switch, I first removed the original plastic throw bar and replaced it with these PC board ties, and that now acts as the new throw bar. But what this allows me to do is, because the original throw bars that come factory installed just have two little metal tabs on them, which they use to solder the rails to, it's pretty much impossible to resolder those points to the metal tab, because the metal tab gets too hot and ends up melting the plastic throw bar. So I installed these PC board ties, and what that allowed me to do is basically it gave me an entire tie and lots of room to adjust each point so that I could make sure that the N-scale hand throw would throw all the way over. So I may end up making a video on how I modified these switches. However, for today's video, it's important to keep in mind that you're going to want to make sure that the points are within MRI gauge so that your cars can move and locomotives can move freely without binding on any of the tracks. And as you can see, these rail cars do just that. So like I said, could be a potential future video, and moving on to the rest of the layout. So as I mentioned, I installed these hand throws on all of the turnouts on the branch line with the exception of the mainline switches. And I also got around to installing the hand throws on the upper level yard here. And as you can see, I made the same modifications to each turnout with using the PC board ties. I also have to apologize for the movement of the camera because I'm using my hands instead of the tripod. However, moving to the other end of the yard, you'll see same thing with the hand throws and the same modifications. The only difference at this end was I had to use a longer PC board tie here, and that's just because this turnout's in a hidden position, will be often hidden by cars in one of these storage tracks, so I had to use a longer PC board tie which reached under the tracks. And as you can see, it's lined through right now, and if I go ahead and throw it, there you go, it's thrown. So it works pretty good. I'm pretty happy with everything, and this really worked well in the op session. It eliminated a lot of the derailments in the upper level yard here. The last project that I wanted to have completed in time for the op session was the engine facility. Now the reason for this was just so that I could provide an area for people to be able to set up and take down their locomotive power without kind of interfering with the rest of the layout operations. The first operation session that I had, people were setting up their locomotives on the main line and basically wherever they could find a spot. Now, this wasn't too big of an issue, but given the amount of people that were here most recently, it was definitely a much needed aspect of the layout where people could just, store their power when they're not using it, and like I said, set their power up at the beginning of the op session because there's just too many trains running for people to be setting up on the main line like I was doing previously. So just to provide a little bit of a recap since the last layout update, to your right there are 3 arrival departure tracks. So these 2 tracks here with the oil and freight sitting on it, and then the third one is just past the switch there. That's the shortest arrival departure track. The track beside it, this one here, that is kind of a switch lead for the classification tracks, although most trains will stretch beyond this switch, and there's even more of a lead all the way to the main line if you're switching a large cut of cars. And then beside the kind of switch lead, we have the newly installed engine facility. Now I'll give you a quick rundown of what each track is supposed to represent here in the engine facility. For starters, you have these first 2 tracks here where these locomotives are sitting. Those are the ready tracks, and for those of you who don't know what those are, essentially they're the tracks that the locomotives will sit in once they've been resanded and refueled. So essentially they're ready to go and ready to be put on the next train to leave the yard. The third track there, that is a runaround for the engine facility, so that locomotives, instead of having to either go through a ready track or the engine shop, they can just run straight through here and run to the other side of the yard if they're departing to go towards the branch line or the intermodal yard, etc. Then these 3 tracks here, those are the shop tracks where that white piece of paper is. That is the dimensions for the Walthers modern diesel shop, which I'll end up probably kit bashing and kind of doing my own thing with so that it's unique rather than having the generic kit on the layout. And essentially these 3 tracks are nice and long, that way I can kind of provide lots of storage for units rather than having them all kind of clogged up on the ready tracks there. There is one more track that needs to be installed in order to complete the track layout of this engine facility. However, I anticipate that these 3 tracks are going to need to be realigned or repositioned in order to meet the alignment of the Walthers kit. So I'm going to have to wait until I get that kit in order to install this last track. This last track, along with this third shop track, is going to serve as the sanding and refueling tracks. So I'll have a sanding station right around here and some like diesel fuel pumps probably in this region here. Ideally, I would have liked to have 2 separate tracks for the sanding and refueling rather than feeding off of one of the shop tracks. However, I only have so much space to work with in this one area, and I don't really want to extend the engine facility to another region of the layout or extend the bench work. Because I really anticipate that this will be a really kind of a showcase scene on the layout, I went ahead and spent a little extra money on buying myself a double track sanding tower from Overland Models. This is an amazing model. It's used, so it does require a little bit of touch up, but it came installed with LEDs and the whole show, so it looks fantastic. And once I get that installed on the layout, I think it's really going to start bringing this scene to life, along with that engine shop. But really looking forward to the building and scenery in this kind of scene here, so stay tuned for future updates on this. One last thing about the engine facility before we move on is when I installed it, I went ahead and I isolated each track with the exception of the runaround. Now I isolated these tracks mainly because most of us now have sound locomotives. There's not a whole lot of people that still use DC. The occasional non-sound unit will be on this layout, but for my purpose, all of my locomotives are sound equipped. And when you have an entire area, such as this engine facility, with powered tracks, it's bound to get pretty deafening in here, especially with that much sound radiating from this area. And the other factor is, yes, I could mute them. However, if there is a short on the layout, which it happens, cars derail from time to time, all of those locomotives will want to reboot. So I don't want to have to independently go into every locomotive on the Digitrax throttle to mute the sound once again. I accomplished this by first using Atlas plastic rail joiners. That just created the physical isolation from the power that was provided by the rest of the layout. And then I went ahead and I installed these individual on-off switches with a green light. Now I still have to look into the wiring of these switches a little bit more because I'm not quite sure that I did them right. Because you may or may not be able to tell, the green light is constantly lit no matter if it's on or off. However, I'm not too concerned because it's really only from a distance that you can see that these lights are actually constantly lit, because the switch themselves is kind of angled when they're off, and then they're angled upwards when they're on. And when they're on, as you can hear, that CP5726, it's currently kind of muted or not powered on, but you heard the initial startup sounds there. And if I switch tracks, you'll be able to hear that CN GP40. It's currently DC, so you can probably hear the ringing from it. And then the 6097 is powering up right now. And then if I want to shut off the sound or the track power, I just flip the switch and it's off. The same goes for those two switches over there. Those just turn the power on and off just for the ready tracks. And then just a side note, this empty slot here, that is meant for the switch that will eventually control the power for the last track that has yet to be added. I also went ahead and installed the shop tracks for the upper level. And this one track is it. It's not meant to be anything super special. There's not going to be no engine house or anything. All it's meant for is a quick refueling and maybe resanding. There won't be any fuel pumps or sanding towers likely. It'll just be done by truck because it's not a very big yard, and it's kind of going to be modeled more over as like a crew change point before trains go down to the lower level. So all of the projects that I just showed you were ones that I wanted to have done in time for the ops session. So they were only started and completed a short time before that ops session took place. And the reason for that is, like I said, I just wanted to have those kind of cosmetic things finished. That way it improves the operating abilities of the layout essentially. So now let's move on to the other projects that I worked on over the other 7 months since my last layout update. So over the last few months, I really focused on a lot of sub scenery for the upper level since most of the track work is complete. Most of the yard is complete, the main line is complete and has been completed for a while. The only real track work that needs to be finished on the upper level is the pulp mill, but that won't be for another couple months yet. I'm hoping to start that in the new year. But as you can see, I installed sub scenery just before the yard there. I'm not sure if that hill was completed in the last layout update or not, but if it isn't, or if it wasn't, then that's new for you to see. I also did the cardboard webbing and paper for the riverbanks there for that eventual bridge scene. Also in the corner, I did, and along the backdrop, I did some more kind of hills, and I really made this quite a large hill because I wasn't able to round that corner just based off of the small distance in there, so or the hardboard would break because it was too sharp of a corner. So I tried to really hide that 90-degree corner in there, and I think it was pretty successful in doing that and making it look kind of realistic. Still kind of undecided on what I'm going to do in the cubby hole there, if I'm going to do more mountains or if there's going to be a town or like rock quarry type scene. And then along this backdrop here is where a lot of the sub scenery took place. So obviously this is mainly just mainline track. There's no actual industry in here. And I have basically completed all of the sub scenery from one end of the wall to the other. Now I'll go ahead and I'll kind of move the camera around to show you the different, like, I guess, landscape contours and how I did it. So I'm going to hand bomb some of this next videoing just because my tripod doesn't quite reach, and it'll give you a better idea of what the land contours look like. So in this area here where this tunnel portal is, it'll eventually be kind of the bottom end of a lake. There won't be much of a lake scene there, but there'll be a beach, and I've kind of made the mountain contours in such a way that I'll eventually add maybe some cliff jumpers in there, a little canoe, obviously I'll pour the water and so forth. So I think that will be kind of a neat scene. As you saw, the track enters a tunnel, and enters a tunnel for about maybe 2, maybe 3 car lengths, and it exits right here into a corner and then into the siding over here. Now I went ahead and I permanently installed this tunnel portal finally, and if you haven't seen my video on how to make a tunnel lining, please check it out. I think it turned out pretty good. And especially after seeing James's video on YouTube with his camera car, I think it looks even better because now it's not just like a foam cutout or an empty space in there like my last layout. So you'll be able to see kind of the different land formations and how the hills kind of reach up and how I've made it look like the tracks have kind of cut through those land formations. And we're at the other end of the siding now, and as you can see, I continued the sub scenery all the way through to the other corner of the room here. Now this section in here, I'm probably going to change up. I don't like the way that these are kind of pointed as they are, so I might kind of modify it a little bit to make it look a little more fluid, and then also provide as a little more of a scene block between the lines. And I'll get to what this is here in just a minute, but taking a closer look, you can see another nice large hill in the back there, and eventually a nice little river scene through here with some kind of whitewater rapids and such. And then you can see some areas where I haven't put paper over yet. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with my method of constructing the sub scenery, I just use the cardboard webbing method and extruded foam to kind of add some structural support to the cardboard, and it makes things a little more rigid and I guess less pliable in a sense. That way it doesn't collapse if you put any pressure on it, because this cardboard is quite flimsy, although it does stiffen up quite a bit once you get the hot glue on there and kind of glue all of the webbing or pieces of cardboard together. You can also see here at the end of the yard, I still have to put the paper on these two little hills. And then basically that'll be it for the sub-scenery on the upper level. I can pretty much start applying the plaster and getting that hard shell on top of the paper so that I can start painting, cutting in rock faces, and applying scenery. Now for those of you who are new to the channel or maybe unfamiliar with my plans, the pulp mill that I've made reference to a couple times in this video will eventually be stationed here. As you can see, it's kind of a storage area for some of my boxes and locomotives and cars that I'm not using at the moment. So like I said, hopefully in the new year I'll get that project underway, and that'll be one of the main industries on this layout, which will suck up quite a few cars, probably have its own switcher, and will be one of the main operations for cars going to the upper level or coming from the upper level to the lower level. So as promised, I was going to discuss what this track in the foreground was here, and this is just another example of how I like to complicate the projects that I start. And essentially what this track is the lead for the lumber mill. So I complicated this project by imposing a grade into the lumber mill, and you'll be able to see, you may or may not be able to see, yeah, that's a pretty good angle. The track comes up about 1.5 inches, so it actually sits above the mainline height. It plateaus through this region, it just sits flat, and then it goes down a pretty hefty grade into the lumber yard. And then it separates into two tracks, and this will primarily get center beam flat cars. There's some pulp mill cars in the back there just because some people were messing around with some switching. But this will primarily receive center beam flats. And this grade wasn't too much of an issue, except it was pretty difficult to get this transition from the grade to level ground. It was pretty difficult to get that right without the cars looking like they're kind of binding up against one another, and it took a little bit of work, but it looks pretty fluid now, and I'm quite happy with the results. Obviously I got to get scenery to hide all the cork and cardboard shims, but that's not much of an issue. So pretty happy with the way this turned out. All these lumber loads here, they're not finalized, they're just kind of sitting there to represent a lumber yard. But once again, another industry that kind of adds a little more operation to the layout, and I'm pretty impressed with it. Just before I wrap up this video, I wanted to provide an update on the underlevel staging. It hasn't been worked on in a while, and I'm pretty sure the state that you're going to see it in right now is just about as far as I was when I last uploaded an layout update. So you can see the hole in the benchwork has been cut, and from this view you weren't able to see, but the ramp down under the benchwork is also installed, and that's about as far as I got with that. And then you'll be able to see that the posts that'll eventually support the underlevel staging are also visible, and that's as far as I have got with that. It hasn't been a priority project, but as I begin to unbox more of my rolling stock, which I'd say about 2/3 of it is now on the layout, so I still have a fair bit of rolling stock that's still in boxes. Once I get the urge to start unboxing that and I need more storage on the layout, then I'll probably get the urge to continue this project, but for now it is not a priority. Well everyone, that concludes today's layout update. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I apologize once again for waiting so long before uploading another one. With Christmas holidays rapidly approaching, I anticipate that I'll get a few days off that I'll be able to use in order to chip away at some projects upstairs here, and then hopefully have another layout update uploaded before the new year. So as always guys, thanks for watching. Feel free to give this video a like if you enjoyed it. Any comments, questions, or concerns, drop them in the comments section below and I'll be more than happy to address them. And if you haven't subscribed already, feel free to do so if you enjoy my content, and we'll see you next time right here on my channel.